tree, and it's in the link as a PDF if you want to just have that for yourself. It's also, some of the religion professors on BYU campus should have them too. And it's also at CAPS, the flyer, so you can ask anyone else for that flyer. But we're so fortunate to have Claire with us today, and we're so grateful for Cole. He's the one that got this together. He the whole thing, basically. He's the reason you guys know about it. But yeah, Cole's gonna introduce Claire and we'll go from there.
Claire Breedlove is a licensed clinical social worker who specializes in working with members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to provide culturally competent, evidence-based treatment for religious OCD, also known as scrupulosity. Claire is an active member of the International OCD Foundation, has completed the IOCDF's Pediatric Behavior Therapy Training Institute. She is also a certified SPACE provider, SPACE being supportive parenting for anxious childhood emotions, and is licensed to practice in California, Utah, Idaho, Arizona, and Texas. Claire holds master's degrees from Johns Hopkins University and the Tulane University School of Social Work, and currently serves on the board of directors of the Mormon Mental Health Association. She is also an adjunct faculty member at the University of Utah College of Social Work, where she teaches in their MSW program. More information about her is available on mountainhomeocd.com. Everyone, let's give it up for Claire.
Yeah, everyone, it's great to be here. I live in the South right now, and so we are dangerously close to the edge of time when it's too cold for me to come to Utah. So I'm glad I got in when I did. Okay. Okay, so tonight I'm going to talk about, thank you to the Real OCD Club, and especially to Cole for organizing this event. It's great to be here. Tonight I'm going to be talking about a form of obsessive compulsive disorder known as OCD. So first to start, like, what is OCD? Just for those of you who aren't in the club yet. So it involves two things: obsessions. So when you're really focused on one particular thing, and then compulsions, which is something you're doing either physically with your body or mentally to try to manage the anxiety that obsession is created. So this scrupulosity goes way back to the medieval period, when there are a lot of accounts of Roman Catholic priests and monks who were really tortured by it. So my practice, 95% of the people I work with in my therapy practice are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And so some common things that I see them worried about are feeling like you don't have enough faith, that you're not worthy, that you have to have absolute certainty that the church is true, fear of breaking the law of chastity when you're not doing anything that anyone else would be considering breaking the law of chastity, fear of being gay, we'll talk more about that, and fears related to having found the right romantic partner. So outside of the normal, just do I want to keep seeing this person or whatever. Okay, so as you may have noticed on that list, there are a lot of things that I worry about, you worry about, lots of people worry about. So when do we know when this is a symptom of OCD and when this is just a normal part of life? So the first thing we look at in scrupulosity treatment is how different is what you're doing from everyone else in your community. So, if you asked the general American population, what would you think if somebody was wearing religious underclothing? They would think that's crazy, that's a zealot. But of course, in our community, probably many of us in this room are wearing them. It's totally normal. So, similarly, when we're asking these questions, we want to see okay, are you worried about these things in a different way than your peers are worried about them? We also look at evidence-based assessments to see if you have symptoms of OCD. So it's really unusual for somebody to come to me and only have symptoms of scrupulosity. 98% of the time, will have other symptoms of obsessive compulsive disorder as well. So a couple of the assessments that I use to just kind of help sort this out, something called the Yale-Brown Obsessive Compulsive Scale, and then the PISR is a Scrupulosity scale. And I like email these to people from a website now, but I used to go through it like question by question with people. And oftentimes people would say, oh, wait, I do that and I didn't realize it was a symptom of OCD. Second thing, OCD is heavily genetic. So I always ask, hey, anybody else in your family got this going on? Like, you have a mom who's really anxious. And most of the time, people are able to identify like at least one close relative who has some kind of anxiety issues. And then, the final things that we look at, sometimes people are like, well, I just have these quirky interests, but it doesn't bother me. Like, I'm just weird. Like, does that mean I have OCD? And the answer is no. Like, you do whatever, you want to do, unless it is really disruptive to your life. So on the Yale-Brown Obsessive Compulsive Scale, we'll actually ask you, like, how many hours a day are you spending on your obsessions and your compulsive behavior? And for people with clinically significant OCD, that's 3, 6, 9, 12 hours a day. And then how much are you doing compulsive behaviors? So, like the classic example of this is like somebody who can't get out of the house because they're so busy checking to make sure that like the lights are turned off, the curling iron's unplugged, like all that kind of stuff. And are they affecting your functioning? So, usually the people who I see in an outpatient setting, so like we do, telehealth over Zoom, they're very upset about their symptoms and it's starting to really bother them, but they're still going to work, to school, and all of those things. And so what we want to do in treatment is make sure that you keep being able to do what you want to do, and are able to manage your anxiety in a way that will happen. So compulsions that are really common for Latter-day Saints who are dealing with scrupulosity and kind of related symptoms, need to confess. This is a really big one. When people are anxious, it's natural to want reassurance that everything's going to be okay. So, if one of my kids comes to me and says, hey, like, I'm scared of the dark, I want to be in my room by myself, I can say like, oh, it's okay. Like, everything's fine. You're safe. Like, your sister's not going to bug you, whatever. And they might go back into their room and be okay for, some amount of time, but then maybe they see like a shadow out of the corner of their eye, or they hear something out the window and get worried. And so then they come back and they want to know again, is it going to be okay? And it turns into this cycle of seeking reassurance that there's like no risk, when that's like actually just not possible most of the time in life. So this is something that people do a lot. Excessive or repeated prayer, this happens sometimes. Like an obsessive focus on like trying to make sure that they believe enough or that they're faithful enough. Mental efforts to neutralize, erase, replace, or otherwise control bad thoughts. This is a big thing. Human beings have like 50, 60,000 thoughts a day. And most of it is random, kind of, we're not even aware, in one ear, out the other. And we don't really know why certain thoughts that become the subject of obsessions for people, why they get really but what we do know is that like you can't control whatever random thought pops into your head. But some people with OCD spend a lot of time trying to do this, and it usually ends up being a thing. And this is another one, avoidance of triggers of things believed to be inappropriate. So these are things like the news, like seeing people in class, like really, things that anyone who doesn't have OCD would consider to be totally benign. So there's a lot of really interesting research being done right now about what causes OCD. We know that it's fundamentally a problem with the neurotransmitter serotonin. And we know that OCD also runs in families and that genes play a huge role in the development of OCD. There's super interesting research being done right now at Baylor College of Medicine, actually trying to identify the specific genes that are responsible for OCD in the hopes that in 10, 20 years, we can just do a little cheek swab and know what's going on. And we know that environmental factors play a role in kind of shaping the flavor of people's OCD. But OCD isn't something that's caused by specific trauma, anything like that. And what I hope that you take away from this slide is that OCD is really just like any other chronic condition. It's like diabetes. You have a genetic predisposition. There are probably some environmental or lifestyle factors that, factor in there. And then in order to control it, you're probably going to need some medication and some kind of lifestyle changes, therapy, that kind of thing. OCD is the exact same thing. So the bad news for everyone in this room, well, except for Carl, is that you're kind of in the prime stage of life. If you're gonna get OCD, it's probably gonna be in your late teens or early 20s. And this is particularly dicey for our community because this is also coincides with the time when when some people are going on missions. And so that can be a really interesting combination. We'll talk about that some more in the case studies. But OCD, nonetheless, it's a relatively common illness, 1 in 100 adults. And about 5% of people with OCD have primary scrupulosity, but a much larger number, about a third, will have some symptoms. Okay, so this is the number one question I get asked. Latter-day Saints don't have a higher incidence of scrupulosity than any other group of religious people. It is interesting, I'm in a consultation group right now with a bunch of Catholics, and it is very interesting how scrupulosity for them looks very different than scrupulosity in our community does. But the church isn't causing scrupulosity. And actually, I kind of in my work with clinicians of other faiths or clinicians who work with people of other faiths, I've actually come to believe that we have a lot of advantages as a community in terms of the treatment of scrupulosity. So as I was, kind of talking earlier, that it is important when you're treating religious OCD to figure out okay, how outside of the norm is what you're doing. And because our faith is relatively small, it's heavily centralized, and we have relatively homogenous beliefs compared to Protestant Christians or something like that. It's actually very easy for me as a therapist to figure out if what you're doing is outside the norm. Many of my colleagues spend a lot of time talking to the rabbi, talking to the priest, trying to figure out what's going on, and I have never had to do that. Another thing that's really helpful is that our ecclesiastical leaders, I think, are my experience has been 100% that they're totally supportive of professional therapists treating scrupulosity, and are always, I've never anything but totally great. I think the Latter-day Saints the young adults especially, and kids also, tend to have really high levels of community support, which is really helpful for treatment. And parents tend to be really involved, which may be kind of annoying if you're a parent sometimes, but from my perspective, it's treatment. So as I kind of mentioned earlier, almost everyone with scrupulosity experiences other OCD themes. So this is kind of, a long list, but in the case studies, I'll talk more about, and you'll kind of see how the scrupulosity gets kind of played out alongside other OCD symptoms. So, the good news is that, OCD is not a great illness to experience, but it is very, very treatable. So the gold standard treatment is a combination of a high dose of an SSRI, so something like Zoloft, Prozac, Lexapro, like really common medications, easy to get, super cheap, well tolerated. And exposure and response prevention, which is the kind of therapy that I do. And we know from studies that this combination is effective for about 70% of people with mild to moderate OCD. This is like a staggeringly high number, like success rate for a mental health intervention. So even though, you know, the pain and the difficulty of OCD is real, and in particular, it's hard for people to get a correct diagnosis and treatment. But when they do, they do really well. So exposure is kind of just what it sounds like. Like if you come to me and you tell me you're afraid of a spider, I'm going to start out and I'm going to show you something that triggers the fear of spiders, but not in like a super intense way. So I'll show you a picture of a spider. You'll look at it and you'll probably get a little bit anxious, but then, you know, very quickly you'll come back down to normal. So you've just had the experience of your anxiety being triggered, but having the experience that the anxiety is temporary and not dangerous. So then we show you the picture again. And this time your anxiety is probably going to spike back up, but probably a little bit less than the first time because you've just had that experience of, you know, like not dying. And so then we continue like that until you become like, you get used to the picture of the spider, you become habituated to it, like you don't care about it anymore. It's not like whatever. And so then we move on to something that's a little bit more triggering. So maybe like you're watching YouTube videos of spiders over and over and over again. And then, you know, maybe I send you to the zoo and you're like looking at the spiders in the case or whatever. And then finally, you know, you go and get some kid down the street and you're like petting the tarantula. So in a structured and supported way, I gradually expose you over and over again to what you're afraid of until you're used to it, until it doesn't bother you anymore. So I can, just like I can expose you to the spider, I can also expose you to ideas. And I'll give you some examples of those in the case studies. And then the second part of ERP is the response prevention. So just like with OCD, you have the obsession and then the compulsive behavior. The exposure addresses the obsession, and the response prevention addresses the compulsion. So like you think if you're like, when you're in it with OCD and you haven't had any treatment, you think the compulsion is helping. The compulsion is not helping you. So the first thing we do is work on just like delaying the compulsion. And then eventually we want you to like stop doing the compulsion. Some people are criticize exposure because they think it's barbaric. And we're just exposing you over and over again to the things that are most terrifying to you. And I am sensitive to those concerns. So, you know, we're not going to do it in like a crazy way. So if I, you know, on a scale of 0 to 10, like just decide to like start you off out the gate with something that's a 10 out of 10, the thing that you're most terrified of in this world. Like, you're not going to learn anything from that. It's just going to be terrible and you're going to hate me and you're not going to come back to therapy. So instead, I'm actually really careful, I hope, to, you know, I don't ever want anybody to be doing exposures at more than like a 3 or a 4 out of 10, because this is really the sweet spot that we found through research where you're like a little bit uncomfortable, but everybody's fairly sure you can get through it. And so then you have the experience of doing the exposure, and then you're like, oh, that wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. Like nothing terrible happened. And so then you feel encouraged and you keep going. Some people are worried. And it's happened actually that, you know, like the classic kind of old school scrupulosity exposure was like having people like rip out pages of like sacred texts, like the Bible, Book of Mormon, something like that. And I think that is not useful, but it also is a deterrent for some people, especially with scrupulosity. It's a deterrent to them seeking care. And so, you know, I started seeing scrupulosity cases, like it wasn't something that I like sought out. I had like a general OCD practice, but, you know, a friend who was in a leadership position, knew of a kid who had come home early from his mission because of scrupulosity, called me up, said like, hey, do you know anything about this? And I was like, I guess a little bit, but I've never treated one. And anyway, that was the beginning. But it was because the person, the missionary, was afraid to go to therapy because they thought they were going to have to do terrible things that would cause them to, break their covenants, go against their values. But when they found out like I was a member of the church, whatever, they felt comfortable. So when you're doing exposures, the point is really to help you get comfortable doing something, knowing that there's a possibility something might go wrong. So people with OCD are really, really uncomfortable with uncertainty. And I think that that's like human nature to a certain extent. But in order to like function in the world, like if you want to drive a car, you got to be comfortable with a fair amount of uncertainty that like some idiot might plow into you, that the car might stall, something might happen. But for people with OCD, this fear of uncertainty becomes really paralyzing. So, when we're doing when we're doing the exposures, like, I don't want you sitting there being like, no, it's okay. The spider's not going to bite me. Like, it's going to be all right. Like, it's not poisonous, because you're reassuring yourself. Instead, I want you to say like, okay, I know there's a small chance that something might happen. We're just going to have to wait and see. And when you learn to sit in the uncertainty, as opposed to like getting caught up in this endless cycle of reassurance, it's very effective in reducing your anxiety. And if you would like to pick up one of my stickers that I made that are only funny to people who have OCD, I think they say maybe, maybe not on them, because I say that like a million times a day in treatment, because it's like, yeah, maybe something's going to happen. Maybe it's not. Like, we don't know. We're just going to have to wait and see what happens. Frequency and duration of exposures. So exposure is like probably the most effective mental health treatment that's out there. But people are not always clamoring to do it because it can be kind of unpleasant, because you're, sometimes, you're looking at the spider over and over again. And you have to, it takes time. So for exposure to be really effective, you need to be doing it like every day. And people aren't usually in like active exposure, whatever, with me for more than a few months. But when you're doing it, you have to really be doing it for it to be effective. So, common exposures in my practice. Yeah, like all of these things are things really that, well, in vivo, that means like something you do in real life. So all of these exposures are things that people are doing in their day-to-day life, but are causing a lot of anxiety for people with OCD. So what we want to do is like strip back that activity to something that is manageable, and then kind of like build you back up. So if you have a lot of anxiety about the temple, very common, very, very common, I'm not going to like send you into like back-to-back endowment sessions. That would be too much. We might start out, I have you like, you sit in the garden outside for 20 minutes. And then when you're cool with that, maybe you go into the lobby for a little while. And then maybe you do a single initiatory. And then maybe you do all 5 initiatories. And then, we send you into the endowment. So, it's all about your anxiety in manageable ways. And then imaginal exposures are also really useful in scrupulosity treatment, obviously, because the anxieties are usually about things that are ideas. And so, there are some scrupulosity therapists that rely really heavily on these things called imaginal exposure scripts. And it's where you kind of play out the underlying fear underpinning your anxiety. And in kind of the traditional use of these scripts, we would have people read them over and over and over again. In my experience, people really don't like doing that. So sometimes we just do it as kind of a diagnostic that's, sometimes people aren't really aware kind of what is going on beneath the surface. So it can be a useful tool. So here's a imaginal exposure script. So this was a woman who was a BYU student who was married, and anytime her husband would pull out his phone in sacrament meeting, she would just lose it. So, we have this script here about kind of what her mind was going to when she saw him pull out his phone. So this was helpful, getting her to the end. Yeah, she's worried that like it's not going to work. The marriage isn't going to work, and that her family's going to be messed up forever. So I did actually ask her husband at the end of treatment what he was looking at, and he said it was his scriptures. So yeah, treatment considerations, kind of already talked about this, but there used to be an idea in exposure treatment in ERP, kind of old school people, like the people who trained me. And the idea was that you needed to do these like really extreme exposures. So in therapy, so that then in real life, when people were confronting situations that were less extreme, they would be cool with it. So, the kind of classic example that I always think of to illustrate this point, one of the guys who trained me, who is a very well-known researcher, he would have people with HOCD, so they had obsessive fears that they were gay, they were not gay. And so he would be like watching gay porn with them. And that was like a standard kind of thing. And so people hear about this in our community and are like very worried before they get into exposure. And so like, you don't have to be that extreme. I'm not ever going to ask somebody to do anything in therapy that I'm not going to do myself, that I wouldn't have my kids do. Like, nothing crazy. And I think, even though any well-trained OCD therapist could do what I do, I think it is reassuring that, I have a temple recommend, it's a calling, like I'm not going to do anything nuts. Okay. So, of being at BYU because it's the only place where I can drink as much Diet Coke as I do and not be judged. So Jordan, 18-year-old, was doing like a year at BYU before her mission, and she turned in her papers and then started having pretty intense scrupulosity symptoms. She was like really unsure if like the church was true and praying like a lot to try and reassure herself. So like I kind of talked about earlier, one of the reasons that I know scrupulosity is about OCD and not actually about people's faith or about the content of anybody's obsessive thoughts is because we do all these tests. So these assessment scores, they're clinically significant for OCD and scrupulosity. So she got on some Prozac, I think, and we did 3 months of ERP in the time between her submitting her mission call and actually leaving the mission. And we really focused on just like delaying the like obsessive prayer. And what usually happens with compulsive behaviors is there's a very intense like spike of desire to perform the compulsion initially. And then if you can like get over the hump, it gets a lot easier. So that's really kind of what we work on in the response prevention. And then we also did some imaginal exposures. So I'm on our mission now. She sends me emails with a lot of emojis, so I think she's doing well. Okay, somebody else. This was a kid who had been out on his mission for a hot second, and he started calling his parents a whole bunch and was really worried that he was not a good missionary and also that he now suddenly was gay. And so his mom called me and was very concerned. Did spend a lot of time like trying to tell me that they're definitely not homophobic, but very concerned about these symptoms. And anyway, so when I met with a client, he was great. And he told me that suddenly he was feeling like he was attracted to like all of his various companions, some really old dudes. I did not ask him what he meant by that. And most interestingly, the portrait of Jesus on the cover of the Preach My Gospel manual. So what I told him was like, okay, like you may be gay, I don't know. But I know for sure from those assessment scores and also from everything that you just told me that you definitely have OCD. So we're just going to treat your anxiety and then we'll see what happens, right? So we got him on some meds, we did some ERP. He was doing a lot of reassurance seeking behavior. So we worked on that. We spent a lot of time too with, for some people with OCD, we find that with treatment, the intensity and the frequency of the intrusive thoughts usually decreases, but for a lot of people, there are always going to be some random thoughts. I mean, for all human beings, right? And so sometimes working on accepting that the thoughts, may still be there to a certain extent, and also understanding that that's because the thoughts come into your head. It doesn't mean that like there's something wrong, that this is what you want, anything like that. And then we also did, this is a great exposure that I call hot or not. So, in this situation, he was afraid to look at any men because he was worried he was going to have intrusive thoughts that he was gay. So in therapy, we actually just had him look at people on, at the grocery store, on the news, whatever, work on it that way. So he actually went back to the mission field after treatment. So, okay, this is really, the reason I included this case study is because some people wonder why, like, if you have scrupulosity, like, why wouldn't you just leave the church? And the reason is because, like, the scrupulosity is not about the church, it's about your anxiety. And so if you just leave the church, you may not be anxious about the exact same thing anymore, but you're going to be anxious about something else. And that's what happened in this case. So this guy went to BYU, started having a lot of OCD symptoms around not having enough faith, feeling like he needed to confess everything. He didn't have any concerns about like anything substantive. That's not what this was about. And that's never what it's about when you have scrupulosity. So he actually dropped out of BYU because he was so bothered by his symptoms. And he went home and had a lot of trouble functioning. And that is unfortunately because, even though he removed some specific triggers, he didn't address the underlying anxiety. So he also had clinically significant scores for OCD and scrupulosity. So he started medication and we did exposures, actually, like gradually having him go back to church, essentially. And he did some imaginal exposures as well. And then he eventually came back to BYU, and he actually is already married by now. But anyway, yeah, totally fine. So, I guess the main thing I want you guys to take away is that scrupulosity is not a problem of faith, it's a problem of anxiety. And all of these other things that people have obsessive thoughts about, morality, being good enough, worthiness, sexual orientation, contamination, any of it, it's not what they're saying it's about. It's about the anxiety, if that makes sense. So again, a really effective treatment, medication plus exposure and response prevention. And if I could tattoo anything on my forehead, your OCD symptoms are not a sin. You do not need to repent for them. OCD symptoms are always, we call ego dystonic. So it means they're contrary to what you want. So that's why they're so disturbing, because it's contrary to your values and your character. So I do not believe that a kind and loving Heavenly Father would expect us to repent for something that we cannot control and do not want. So you don't need to repent, you need to get space treatment. Oh, wait, I have one more thing. Okay, sorry. Shameless plug. So I am in the process of becoming certified to train other therapists in a pediatric anxiety protocol that was developed at the Yale Child Study Center. And I need a couple more families. So if you know of like an 8 to 15-year-old, maybe you have a little sibling or a cousin who's very anxious, my way.
have some questions.
Yeah. Could you touch on the differences that you see of scrupulosity between our faith tradition and others? You kind of hinted at that earlier, like with Catholicism and whatnot, so.
So like with Catholicism, it's interesting because they are like the Catholic Church is so big and so bureaucratic in a way that our faith is not. So like they actually have these priests who are like specialized, they're like scrupulosity confessors. Because Catholics can like, it's not like us where it's like, go to your ward where you live, like go anywhere else, right? So, which is a protective factor for Latter-day Saints with scrupulosity. So people who are Catholics and have scrupulosity will like shop around to like a bunch of different priests and they'll be confessing to like lots of people. And so they have developed this like really interesting like sub-specialization of priests called scrupulosity confessors who like kind of know about ERP and that people will get like funneled to them. But one of the scrupulosity confessors wrote this book and I've been on a panel with him. He's a really nice guy. And he sent me a copy of his book and I was really excited to read it. And I opened it up and it was just like every random question that a person with scrupulosity had ever asked him. And then his answer. Which of course is not what we want to do in ERP. We want to just get you comfortable with the fact that you got to make your best guess and it might be wrong, it might be right, we don't know. But yeah, it's like very confession oriented. And I think Latter-day Saints sometimes are worried about confession, but I mean, if you look at the handbook, the kinds of things we're actually required to confess to a bishop, it's like serious sins. So it's not like a big part of our lives. Yeah.
So you talked about how OCD is largely genetic. Do we see within subgroups within the church people of different descent, like I don't know, European versus Latin versus Polynesian? Is there one that has more versus another? Or
That's a good question. I don't know if my sample size is big enough. I know it. I mean, I think there's also a question of access to care. The people I treat are largely look like the people in this room. But I do have a Polynesian colleague who practices here in Provo actually, and she'll every once in a while call me up. So I mean, I know it's an issue in other communities as well. It in some of this research that's being done, they're actually really, I think, trying to push to get good samples from Latin and African communities because there is a concern, obviously, that the research has been like overwhelmingly white until this point.
So I have a girlfriend who has OCD, and we all the time talk about her concerns with her faith and just a lot of things that you've covered today. And she's gone to therapy and a few other things. What's something that I can do personally to help support her when those conversations come up or when those concerns of hers start to circulate and she starts to spiral a little bit?
So, a good rule of thumb is that, if you ask the question once and you're okay with the answer, then it's an information gathering question. And those are really good. But if you ask the question once and then you think you need to ask it a bunch more times, that's your OCD, and that's probably not helpful. So, you want to, in like a kind and loving way, just kind of lean into the uncertainty. So if she's worried, like, well, I don't know if the church is true, like because of whatever I read, or I don't know. And it's like, well, I don't know, maybe like it that could be true. We'll have to wait and see.
One of the questions I have is in regards to relationship OCD within the church. What are some standard protocol that you do for that in terms of exposure and response? Like what, I mean, it's a problem because they're not just thinking about the relationship as it is now, but they're thinking about the eternities. And that's a really challenging thing to treat. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is this, so there's a therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy that kind of most people, I included, I kind of incorporated into the exposure. And it's basically exactly what it sounds like, that, you know, you really have to work on, like, if you're gonna get married, that, you know, statistically, there's a decent chance it might not go that well. And, you know, there's no amount of talking about, you know, the important thing is that it's not like ROCD cases don't happen in abusive relationships or in relationships where any, you know, kind of common sense observer would say like, oh, that, don't know about that. So it really is about, like, it's not about the person that you're dating or you're married to. It's about your inability to tolerate uncertainty. And so we really work on trying to like reframe that, like, okay, you know, I'm never gonna feel 100% sure that this is right. Like, that's not possible. And so I'm gonna make the best decision I can with the information I have at the time. And
Do you ever include the partner with the client? Like, is that ever an option or a possibility if it's agreeable to the client?
I talk to many of my clients' family members about, mostly about reassurance seeking behavior and how to support their family members in that regard. But like, it's not like counseling or anything. You got to see somebody else for that. So.
Yeah, I am an MFT. That's why.
Oh, okay, yeah. No, it's really just in the, you know, there are two things that family members, and we see this with kids, but we also see it, you know, with adults and other family relationships as well, that there are two things family members can do that will make anxiety worse. Reassurance, which we've talked about a lot, and like accommodations. So things that you're doing to make it easier for people to be anxious. So I'll give you my all-time favorite example of accommodation. 12-year-old girl had a lot of anxiety about kind of moral things like her goodness, if she was honest enough, and also had really intense contamination and OCD symptoms. And her anxiety symptoms were so bad, she was having a lot of stomach aches. And her father was a physician. And so she's going to like take over the world one day probably, but she had convinced her dad to prescribe her Zofran.
Yeah.
And so when I met with the family, I was like, okay, guys, so the good news is we're going to do some stuff. The bad news is the Zofran has to stop. And I mean, you know, the crazy thing about kids, right? They're better at exposure than anyone else. But after like 3 weeks of treatment, the stomach aches were gone. And, you know, but anyway, so like, don't give your family members Zofran. Like, don't, you know, if they need to do weird stuff because they're anxious, you want to encourage them to, you know, not disrupt family life to make that happen.
Listening and help this thing. I was thinking that a lot of this therapy is about kind of the act of like facing fears and kind of letting go. Is that kind of what you describe this as?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are actually like a lot of lessons that we can learn from OCD treatment, even for people who don't have OCD, and especially for people of faith, that, you know, we can never be 100% sure that this gospel is true, but, you know, we move forward anyway, in spite of that uncertainty. And that's really in a different way what you have to learn to do with OCD.
How long are you like supposed to stay on the medication? Because you said medication and exposure therapy, so a timeline.
So there are like a few scenarios.
What was the question?
Meds, how long would you stay on meds? So I really do encourage people to think of it like any other chronic illness. And so, but some people are really reluctant for various good reasons, usually, to not take meds. So in those cases, I say, okay, let's try 3 months of exposure and see where you're at. And if you're good in 3 months, and for milder cases, that's totally possible, then great. And if not, then, you know, we can start the meds. The best case scenario is for people to start meds when they start treatment. Because the meds, the way people describe it is that it makes it easier to handle the thoughts, like they're less overwhelming. And so, and most SSRIs take about 4 to 6 weeks to like build up in your system and get to a therapeutic level. So it's like this beautiful synergy in exposure therapy, because if I can get somebody like going on some Lexapro or something, usually right at the time when we're getting to their like harder exposures into the meat of it, the meds are kicking in and that makes it easier for them to do the exposures. So that's great. And then, some people are like, you can pry my Lexapro out of my cold dead hands and they never want to go off it, and that's awesome. And then other people decide that, in ERP, the point is for you to develop the skills to manage your own anxiety. And so some people get to the point where they're like, no, I actually feel really good about what I'm doing. Like, I understand my triggers. I understand, how to recognize when I need to start doing exposures myself on my own. And they go off meds and they're okay. The one situation where I am a little bit like, I just want to like have people watching is with pregnant women and like postpartum women. And they all do fine. It's just, you want to make sure that you're in that situation, you have really good access to like a team of people who know what they're doing.
Is there an age, like, I guess better worded, how young in a child can you like start noticing signs of OCD or be like, that it might not just be like a quirk, or is that kind of a hard question?
No, that's a good question. I mean, usually it's like 7 or 8, although, I mean, of course, people see there are cases of kids that are younger. I mean, the interesting thing is actually that last slide that I had, when we work with kids, especially like under 12, it's mostly actually with the parents on just reducing the accommodation and the reassurance seeking behavior. And the studies show that that's actually just as effective as like working with the kid. And it's usually like easier and effective. So that's what we do. That's what I do.
So I apologize, I came in a little bit late, but could you quickly summarize, what was it, exposure response?
Yeah, so it's
Sorry, I know, I'm sure.
No, it's okay. So it's basically where we, in a like structured way, expose you in like increasingly intense ways to what you're afraid of, so that you get used to it.
Okay,
And then the response prevention is like to get you to stop doing your compulsive behaviors.
okay,
So we get you better with your obsessions, and then we make you stop doing the compulsions.
okay, thank you. And then, with that being said, outside of like formalized professional treatment, is there anything individuals can do on their own that has proven to be helpful when it comes to OCD symptoms?
Yes, so there are actually great self-help books out there. There's actually one about Scrupulosity in Latter-day Saints called Freedom from Scrupulosity by Deborah McClendon. That's very good. But the problem is that like most people don't feel that great about doing exposure on their own, because it's kind of counterintuitive. Like, you're not sure if you're doing it right. So yeah, they have good resources out there, like self-help style books. It's just, I haven't met a lot of people who have like successfully treated their OCD that way.
Yeah, I was just curious.
No, it's a good question. It's kind of an interesting phenomenon.
You see a 70% success rate combining SSRIs with ERP. What is, like, in the research, how many sessions, how many hours of treatment are they doing with those clients? And then what do you see in your private practice?
So like the Edna Foa studies, the kind of like OG, her protocol was 12 weeks of exposure. And that's about what I see in my practice. It's like I was having lunch the other day with a colleague who does like, like psychodynamic kind of, she works with like anxious corporate women or something. And I was asking her, how long are people in her practice? And she said 2 or 3 years, because people are usually in my practice like 3 to 6 months. So it's a pretty fast. This is cool because people get better and
As far as like educationally, I know you have like masters of like social work, but as far as like helping people with scrupulosity, what certificates, licenses, or specific trainings have like helped you to help people with scrupulosity?
I think the best thing was doing the International OCD Foundation's Behavioral Therapy Training Institute, the BTTI, which is like their foundational training. Because really, like, when people ask me sometimes if, you know, it's like, is it weird for you to treat scrupulosity because you're like, I mean, I'm not personally somebody who, you know, I'm fortunate that like I'm at a phase of my life where I feel pretty comfortable in my faith. And it's not because it's just like any other kind of OCD. And so I think the most important thing, if, you know, for people who want to work with Scroop, is just to get really good at treating OCD generally. And those skills will always carry over.
I was curious to know, for the minority of people that ERP doesn't work very well for, what is, like, is there a common issue with those people? Like, is it time that they've had dealing with their problems, or what's kind of the issue there?
So, good question. Common issues are either, so I mean, as you can see, or as you could see, a lot of the symptoms of people I work with are like involve a lot of shame. And so sometimes it's just too much. Like I can't ever get the exposure to be like easy enough that they will do it. And I actually have somebody in my practice like that now. And I mean, he like can't watch the news because he's so triggered that he might be seeing something inappropriate. So that happens sometimes. The bigger problem is usually that just like the exposures like aren't happening in the way that they need to. Usually for a lot of good reasons. Like sometimes with kids, it's really hard. Like, you know, I see lots of kids from really big families where there's a lot going on in the house. And it's hard to get like your 12-year-old to do their scrupulosity exposures for 30 minutes a day after school. So that happens sometimes. And then sometimes people just don't want to do it, that they are not interested in exposures, kind of barbaric, and they want other options. So what I do in those situations is a protocol called inference-based cognitive behavioral therapy, which is another evidence-based treatment for me. And I mean, it's interesting because it's kind of the opposite of ERP in a lot of ways, that, you know, in ERP, it's kind of like everything's uncertain, get used to it. And in ICBT, we actually want you to understand that you can know things through common sense, through lived experience, through observation, and that you can rely on those things, and you can understand that, you know, your OCD is telling you things that are based in like hypotheticals, in, you know, fantastical stories, and kind of how to parse out the two. And you know, it was hard for me as a therapist when I got trained in ICBT because I've been doing ERP for so long, and I was like, what do you mean I can't actually know anything like that? What are you talking about? But for a lot of people, that, you know, that feels more natural for them.
What, if any, difference in your protocol or your standard treatment when you know that there is trauma that may be linked to OCD? Like, you know, with the trauma informed care, looking through that lens, I'm just curious, like, how that might change your exposure protocol.
That's a great question. And I try to be as careful as I can to never have anybody do an exposure that will be traumatic. Because obviously that's, you don't want to traumatize people, that's bad. But it's also just like not effective treatment because it's not going to help them get over their anxiety. So if it's like something not crazy, I will do prolonged exposure protocol with them, which is like kind of an exposure-based protocol for trauma. And if it's something more significant, I'll refer them out for like EMDR or something like that.
You do EMDR.
Yeah, I don't do it. I do know some OCD therapists that do it. I don't, but I'll refer them out and we treat the trauma first and then I'll come back.
Have you ever known if EMDR can also be associated with OCD? Because that's kind of been my experience with one of my clients where we were looking at the trauma and now that's kind of been, I want more EMDR, I want more EMDR. And so I'm just curious if you've ever seen that.
Yeah, I know somebody like that. I had a client like that once too. Maybe it's the same person. And yeah, I mean, I kind of rely on what the person who knows about EMDR is saying. And if the EMDR therapist is like there's no there anymore, like this person should be good, then we just I would just move forward like it's OCD. If, they're like, maybe not, then I might send them back, or we might just switch to ICBT, which is, you don't have the same risk because it doesn't, it's a treatment that doesn't involve exposure. So.
Where's your office?
My office is in the internet now. I actually live in Louisiana now, but I see, I'm all telehealth. And I see clients in California, Utah, Idaho, Arizona, and Texas. So most of my clients are in either Utah or Southern California. And Rexburg, Idaho. There's a lot of scrupulosity there. Surprise, surprise. Yeah.
So if there's someone who like thinks that they're struggling with OCD and anxiety, but also just kind of wants to get like a general, I don't know, kind of like a general counseling, what would you recommend going for first if they already have some background in counseling? Like, would you recommend just like going to like therapy or counseling, or would you recommend like, since they already know like they struggle with that, going to someone who focuses on that first?
So if they actually have OCD, like kind of traditional like talk therapy is not indicated, because talk therapy can just turn into like reassurance seeking. Because the thing is, like, the obsession is not logical, right? Like, you're afraid that you accidentally ran somebody over and didn't notice on your way to this talk. Right? Like, no conversation that we will ever have is going to like make sense of that, because it's crazy, right? So instead of having that conversation over and over again for weeks, as happens sometimes, like, you'll find that when you're in OCD treatment, your therapist is not going to like spend a lot of time asking you about like the content of your obsessive thoughts. Actually, I think that makes people feel better sometimes, like, not because we don't care, but just because it's not helpful. So, if they actually have OCD, they need to see somebody who knows how to treat OCD. But if there are other, kind of milder anxiety issues, paired with like other life things that they want to talk about, then yeah, find somebody they like and do that. Yeah.
Cool. And a follow-up question if we can. Because I've got a friend who was serving a mission and like kind of had like like some religious OCD on their mission. And then like after their mission, like it's been, it's been lessened, let's say, right? It's not as much religious OCD, but like more just like a general anxiety. Would that still apply, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes, if you ask some more questions, there may be some other OCD type things going on. And it's kind of important to figure that out, because you don't want to be at like another big hard time of your life and then have those symptoms again and have to scramble and figure out what's going on. So, I've definitely, I've worked with many people who are like, yeah, something was not good on my mission, but then, it got better, but then they kind of have these lingering problems usually. Of course, it's like a selective sample of like people who come to me. But, and the other thing is, like, if you talk to somebody who knows about stuff, like you don't sign up for life. Like, you can talk to them for sessions and get some answers and kind of, get some psychoeducation about what happened and kind of what you should look for. You start having symptoms again, and go on your way.
Could I get a picture of your last slide?
My what?
Your last slide?
Oh yeah, of course. Please, send me your children. Or actually just their parents, really. The kids are great, but I want the parents. So. And it'll be actually the guy who developed the treatment, Ollie Leibowitz, who's a very well-respected child psychologist at Yale. He'll get to hear all about the kids' cases, so, and tell me what I'm doing wrong, so. More proficient than I usually have.
The stuff for the kids also all telehealth.
Yeah, and but it's not even like that for this protocol. I mean, I'll meet the kids a little bit, but the work is primarily with the parents. Which is good, because it's hard to get an 8-year-old to tell me.
So that practicing like mindfulness, and all of that type of thing is also effective.
Yes, so I love that question. So mindfulness is really helpful for people with anxiety because, anybody who's ever done seated meditation, you have the experience of like, you're sitting there, you're trying to meditate, and then some random thought comes into your head that you don't want to be there. And then you have to figure out what to do about it. So this is exactly what happens when you have OCD as well. So meditation is awesome. Great.
If I could add to that, moderators, because for me, meditation, like mindfulness, became a fixation, was counterproductive at a certain point. So.
Totally. Yeah, anything can become a compulsion. Awesome and interesting.
It's good to write down your thoughts, like, cause I get really bad OCD thoughts, especially at night, that makes me not be able to sleep. So one of my greatest fears is having a panic. I think I think about it closely. So I started writing it down. I'm going to have a panic attack at night. And it's like been helping me because it like makes it okay that it could happen. Is that good?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're like kind of learning how to manage that possibility that you might have a panic attack, which is good. And actually, if you wanted to get really crazy, maybe don't do this on your own, but there is something called an interoceptive exposure that we do these a lot with people who are bothered by panic attacks. So when you have a panic attack, say, and you're really bothered by the sensation that you feel like you can't breathe. So when you're like hyper vigilant about the fact that you like might not be taking a deep breath. So what we do with these exposures is we actually simulate, like I have you like, breathe into a paper bag or something, or if it's dizziness, we got you like spinning around. So it's good to have a sense of humor about exposures. But yeah, that can help sometimes with panic attack type.
Okay, well, there's no more questions. Then always maybe stick around for a few minutes.
Yeah, please take the merch because my kids made fun of me that it was lame. So we'll take it. Take a card. Send me an email. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
And join our club too. You have a community full of people. We're here to support you at BYU.
Oh, that's really good. Thank you. Thanks for coming. Tell your mom and your grandma. Text me and say
Sure, yeah.
all right, bye. Tell your family hi. See you. Good to see you.
Kind of semantic, let's stay with it.
Here's my thing is do that because then I start assessing their breathing and then I not breathe, yes, and then I'm sitting there and I'm like, well, now I can't breathe. So what I've been doing.
The best example of that is I have a friend.
Okay, not like breathing.
Actually, his claim to fame.
You'll have to go like extreme with it.
He had HOCD and then it turned out he was actually gay.